Welcome. I'm Rosario Pisa, the chair of the Department of Gender and Women's Studies at the University of Rhode Island. I welcome everyone to this event. GWS is delighted to present this year's Feminisms in Action lecture titled Indigenous Women and Violence, Feminist Activist Research as a Collective by Professors Shannon Speed and Lynn Stephen.
Nobody is going to ever replace the capacity of a human. And this is why thinking is our number one obsession.
A College of Arts and Sciences education gives you the confidence to bring together all the strands that you value and apply them in ways that are fulfilling for you as an individual, but also resonate out.
You have to really look at schools as a place to grow as yourself. And I think that URI does a great job of that.
There's a sense of pride in the work that you put out there. Students are just excited. Whatever field they're in, they want to be the best at it. And I think that's kind of infectious.
The thing that sets URI apart is that we as a faculty and as an institution ask our students not just what you can do, but who can you be?
Welcome again. The GWS Feminisms in Action lecture offers a platform for feminist activist scholars to address our community on how they engage feminisms, broadly understood and always evolving, in research, scholarship, pedagogy, and on-the-ground advocacy and activist work. Understanding that feminisms are dynamic, organic, contextual, transnational, and global, GWS aims to encourage a dialogue on integrating expertise, values, and activism grounded in a feminist ethos.
Hello and good evening. I'm going to introduce Dr. Shannon Speed. Dr. Speed is a tribal citizen of the Chickasaw Nation of Oklahoma. She is director of the American Indian Studies Center and professor of gender studies and anthropology at UCLA. Dr. Speed has worked for the last 2 decades in Mexico and in the United States on issues of indigenous autonomy, sovereignty, gender, neoliberalism, violence, migration, social justice, and activist research. She has published numerous journal articles and book chapters in English and Spanish, and has published 7 books and edited volumes, including her most recent, Incarcerated Stories, Indigenous Women, Migrants, and Violence in the Settler Capitalist State, which won the Best Subsequent Book Award of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association in 2019, and a Choice Outstanding Academic Title Award in 2020. She has a new co-edited volume entitled Heightened States of Injustice, Activist Research on Indigenous Women and Violence from the University of Arizona Press. Dr. Speed currently serves as the past president of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association. In recent years, she was awarded the Chickasaw Dynamic Woman of the Year Award by the Chickasaw Nation and the Lifetime Achievement Award from the State Bar of Texas Indian Law Section. Welcome, Dr. Speed. And now Rosaria will introduce Dr. Stephen.
Hello, everyone, again. Dr. Lynn Stephen is the Philip H. Knight Chair, Distinguished Professor of Arts and Sciences, and Professor of Anthropology at the University of Oregon. She's also a graduate faculty in Indigenous Race and Ethnic Studies, Latin American Studies, and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. It is an immense honor to welcome Dr. Lynn Stephen to the University of Rhode Island. Lynn and I crossed paths for the first time many years ago, and that serendipitous crossing has shaped my pedagogy, research, and activism ever since. We date back to my days as a naive but eager graduate student at Northeastern University. I was there to study with her and learn by her side, and I did. From being in her courses, to fieldwork in Oaxaca, Mexico, to founding Tonantzin in Boston in 1994, an organization in solidarity with the Mexican indigenous movement, the Zapatistas, to having her shepherd my dissertation. As a queer feminist scholar, she modeled for me how to combine scholarship, pedagogy, and activism. She wasn't just teaching me anthropology, she was teaching me how to use anthropology to be a better human being, how to use anthropology for social justice. What I learned by her side, I still apply today in the classroom, in the field, when I take my students abroad, and most of all, my activism. I'm sure that as she inspired me many years ago, she has inspired many others who have had the good fortune to cross her path, because the ripple effects of those crossings are immeasurable. I continue to integrate her scholarship in my teaching that includes my study abroad program in Oaxaca, Mexico, a place and community I share with my students generously as she shared them with me. There were many monographs and edited volumes. I only have time to acknowledge several seminal works of ethnographic skill and courage. Her groundbreaking first book, Zapotec Women, now in an updated second edition, is described by Elie Bartra as a light in the darkness. Stephen is a brilliant weaver who, with great expertise, intertwines the fine threads of gender, class, ethnicity, nationality, and art, rendering a magnificent tapestry. Applauding her bold, meticulous ethnography of the reception of the Zapatista indigenous movement in Zapata Lives, Histories and Cultural Politics in Southern Mexico, Michael Hertzfeld declares that Zapata Lives is a testament to the struggles and tentative hopes of indigenous populations in Mexico. In Transborder Lives, Indigenous Oaxacans in Mexico, California, and Oregon, Jonathan Fox acknowledges that Stephen's multi-sided ethnography insightfully unpacks globalization from below, revealing the contours of cross-border communities as they weave the social fabric of 21st century North America. And Somos la Cara de Oaxaca, Testimonios y Movimientos Sociales, We Are the Face of Oaxaca, Testimonials and Social Movements, a work that incorporates digital ethnography that Patricia Zavella describes as a magnificent book, a model of engaged scholarship. Lastly, in 2021, in addition to the edited volume she shares with Shannon Speed that will be discussed tonight, Lynn will come out with the eagerly awaited Stories That Make History, Remembering Mexico through Elena Poniatowska's Chronicas this fall. Lynn Stephen's scholarly work centers on the impact of globalization, migration, nationalism, and the politics of culture and indigenous communities in the Americas. She engages political economy, ethnohistory, and ethnography to create a hemispheric lens on major challenges faced by indigenous peoples and others and their creative responses to these challenges. Help me welcome Shannon Speed and my mentor and friend, Lynn Stephen.
Chokma, Hashlaka Chokma, Gabrielino Tongva, Oglakot Yagnimako, Apisa Hanchi, Biika Natoka, Hachimanolili. Good afternoon, everyone. I greeted you in Chickasaw, and I acknowledge that the Gabrielino Tongva are the traditional land caretakers of the unceded lands from which I speak today. Chokmashki, thank you to Rosario Pisa and the Feminisms in Action series for inviting us to talk about the volume today. It's an honor to be with you all, and always great to be with my good friend Lynn. So I'm going to give a little bit of background on the volume and then turn it over to Lynn to talk about some of the conceptual aspects that we were working with and the framing of the book. I suppose the title kind of speaks for itself in a way on what the volume is. It brings together the ethnographic research of 8 feminist scholars who, I think we had a slide that showed the table of contents, but I think that's not going to work. So I'm going to just tell you the names of all the authors that are contributors to the volume, just to acknowledge them and their work on it. So in addition to Lynn and myself, there's Aida Hernandez Castillo, Maria Teresa Sierra, Irma Alicia Velázquez Nimatu, Mariana Mora, Morna McLeod, and Margot Temez. And maybe at some point we'll be able to show the slide that has the titles of their chapters for you. But these scholars have, I think, importantly dedicated much of their careers to illuminating the ways in which Indigenous women have challenged communities and states and legal systems and social movements to promote gender justice within a framework of collective rights. Each of us is in some way engaged our expertise in a wide range of social justice projects, acting as expert witnesses in international and national and immigration court cases, serving as advisors to Indigenous movements and organizations, and questioning analytical frameworks that reduce Indigenous women victims and survivors. And kind of position them, researchers, as experts and counter to that. But so I guess what I want to say is that more than a kind of a collaborative research project, the book is really more the result of an ongoing conversation among a group of friends that has taken place over the course of almost 2 decades, as we periodically gathered with each other and with a number of other activists and scholars who work with Indigenous women. And that conversation evolved as dynamics in the places that we worked evolved. So I'm going to just tell you a little bit about that trajectory that ended up shaping the analytical framing of the book. So we first gathered in Tepoztlán, Morelos, in Mexico in 2008. And that conversation, which also included Maylee Blackwell and Juan Herrera, among others, was mostly about how Indigenous women were engaging new opportunities that were created through the constitutional reforms taking place in Mexico in the and Guatemala in the 1990s. That included some recognition of Indigenous peoples and granted some limited collective rights, and created new laws that were intended to increase access to state justice and non-state justice venues as well, like Indigenous customary law venues, as well as the emergence of international venues for pursuing rights, such as the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and the Inter-American Court. So we put some thought into and later wrote about the process of trying to create a shared intellectual, methodological, feminist framework for understanding women's rights and justice struggles across multiple nation states, and in particular across the U.S.-Mexico border, where Indigenous women's experience is often understood to be quite distinct in the United States from that of Latin America. So the second meeting took place in Mexico City in 2009. Maureen White Eagle, an Ojibwe Cree Métis attorney that works on domestic violence, was with us, and that was generative for our thinking about the relationship of domestic violence to other forms of violence for Indigenous women in the Americas. And then 2 years later, we met in Austin, Texas, and we were then kind of discussing how the shifting of responsibilities to Indigenous communities under neoliberal multiculturalism was taking place, and the slight opening that to encourage women's participation in local systems of justice, and how this had kind of permitted some women to become more active in alternative justice systems, but was also, resulting in simultaneous new exclusions and kind of backlash. By the time we came together again, which was almost 4 years later in 2015 in Tepoztlán, again, the violence in Mexico and Guatemala had seriously escalated, and we were all kind of feeling it in our community work and grappling with how to theorize it in our writing. So the short-lived and kind of partial gains for Indigenous women that came with the multicultural period had receded as national political contexts in Mexico and Guatemala shifted, with national security becoming a dominant discourse and Indigenous human rights increasingly, ending up on the back burner. The discourse of multiculturalism was waning, and in both countries, Indigenous people were increasingly being interpreted by the state either as politically destabilizing and a threat to national security, or as impoverished sectors of society increasingly subject to mega development projects and extractivist industries. Military forces, national police, paramilitary organizations, and organized crime were competing for control of Indigenous territories. And in response to those threats, some Indigenous communities had even self-organized to protect their territories and resources. It was there at Islam we were kind of under this looming shadow of cartel dominance that was like ever present, and we were still managing our rage over the recent forced disappearance of 43 mostly Indigenous normal school students in Ayotzinapa, which had just taken place a couple months earlier. So it was then that we really turned our collective attention much more directly to violence and considered how the heightened role of state security apparatuses, increased economic precarity, and kind of the shifting position of right-wing actors from the fringes to the center of political power were resulting in a dismantling of collective and individual rights. And that not only affected expressions of racialized and gender violence, but the ways Indigenous women seek redress and experience justice struggles. So it was also at that meeting that our discussions turned kind of inevitably toward a discussion of the deep experiences of pain, trauma, empathy, and fear that are necessarily implicated in the work we do, and how each of us cope or not so well cope with the oftentimes conflicting emotional imprint that this kind of work leaves on us as activists and as collaborative scholars. And it was there in Tepoztlán that we first began to discuss the possibility of this volume and kind of sharing our ethnographic understandings, but also, profound personal reflections as engaged feminist scholars, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, working with Indigenous women in the context of violence. So the following year, we came together at a seminar at the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard University, and there our conversation was enriched by the presence of Kimberly Tyden and John Wilshire Carrera. And we had a much more concerted discussion of kind of the settler colonial context and how permanent structures of nation states engaged in ongoing occupation of native lands, might help us to understand how rights that are gained can so quickly vanish, and in these ongoing kind of racial and gendered structures continue to generate violence. So from there, after that meeting, we began drafting our chapters about our feminist engagements with Indigenous women across settler-imposed borders, the violences they face, and the forms of resistance they enact. Lynn and I would come together several more times to co-write in Eugene, Oregon, in La Jolla, California, and Topanga, California. So the volume really represents more than 10 years of collective discussion and dialogic knowledge production. It reflects our efforts towards a shared framework for understanding issues of violence and gender justice for Indigenous women, and our conversations of ethical and emotional aspects of our work. So with that, I'll turn it over to Lynn.
Thank you, Shannon. Thanks for kicking us off. Thank you, Rosaria, for those wonderful introductions. And thank you to Women's and Gender Studies for inviting us. I want to also acknowledge I am speaking to you from the University of Oregon, which is located on Kalapuya Alihi, the traditional Indigenous homeland of the Kalapuya people. Today, Kalapuya descendants are primarily citizens of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Round and the Confederate Tribes of Siletz Indians, and continue to make important communities here and contributions in Oregon and in the world. I'm going to talk just briefly about some of our sort of framing ways of thinking, and a little bit about what some people would call methods, but I think we would probably call collaborative ways of producing knowledge. So I'll abandon the word methods. One of the central frameworks of the book, as you could definitely tell from Shannon's introduction, is settler colonialism and its links to gendered violence. In our book, we conceptualize the US and countries in Latin America as settler societies. Settler colonialism seeks land where colonists envision building a new permanent reproductive and racially exclusive society. Settlers invade in order to stay and reproduce while working to remove, dominate, and ultimately replace Indigenous populations. So this was an ongoing discussion through time about engaging with this concept, but ultimately we felt like it really had a very important power of analysis by looking specifically at how state and state institutions, such as police, court systems, systems of local and regional government, military and paramilitary groups, are agents of ongoing and accumulated violences directed at Indigenous women. And there are different chapters. I don't have time to enumerate them here, but most of the chapters engage with this concept. Another concept that's important really comes from Shannon, I think, neoliberal multi-criminalism, but looking at the ways that practices that criminalize Indigenous people and undocumented immigrants in this country have a long-term impact on women's lives and are tied to different institutions of the state, organized crime, and other actors. Another important concept that I think is a part of the way that all of us have done our work is accompaniment. That's kind of an intensive process of working with women to prepare them for a particular outcome. For many of us, these were legal processes. They could have been in Indigenous legal systems. They could have been in state, municipal legal systems, and federal systems, or even internationally. But it has to do with psychological support, legal education, and intense listening and interaction. So many of us have engaged in those kinds of relationships with groups of women in some of these processes, or individual women as asylum seekers. Another concept, I think, in terms of this legal work is the idea of collective reparations, that in the sort of engagement with interlegalities, that we're not just looking for punishment for individual perpetrators of crime, as they are so often labeled, but really collective reparations that address structural causes for the harm that Indigenous women experience. All of our projects really involved shared strategic, political, and emotional stakes with our interlocutors. And it was very important for us to talk about and process what these political, emotional, and strategic stakes were. Another sort of common theme that you'll see in many of the chapters is looking at Indigenous women's experiences and the telling of stories, of testimonies, as both a political act and as a form of theorization. In other words, that's where we learn from, is from testimony, not from extractions that are detached from Indigenous bodies. One of the other things that we came to realize through our shared discussions, well, that violence against women is not necessarily experienced or understood by our interlocutors as violence against women. It appears in other kinds of registers. It appears in racial violence, in ethnic violence, and economic and physical violence. And it's experienced as interconnected. It's not hived off as violence against women or violence against this particular woman. So it's embedded and it's normalized as a part of larger relationships and structures. A couple more things that we have in common, I think, is just reflecting back on what I said, and I think what Shannon emphasized, that is to tell a story, to speak up, to request asylum, to ask to be heard, has to be seen as a revolutionary act. When women do it in a context where they're silent and are punished for asserting their presence and their voice, whether that's in prison, whether that's with police, in community gatherings, in justice systems. I'm getting a little bit of feedback. I'm just a little sharing with the tech people. Thank you. Another important concept is looking at the links between sexual violence on individual bodies and strategies of territorial control, and also violation of Indigenous territory, whether that's through extraction, through armed presence, through putting down movements that are attempting to defend territory. So I think I'm going to stop there and just end also with what Shannon emphasized, which was the importance of dialogue, of struggle and tension in conversations. Not only that process each of us went through with our interlocutors, but with each other. A real belief that difference, and we went through a lot of these kinds of discussions in writing the introduction, or how do we frame this, but really building a culture of trust and respect for different experiences and different perspectives, and being willing to engage and be okay with some of those differences. Maybe what we have in common are the questions that we ask, and not always unified answers. So I'll stop there, and I think Shannon is going to talk now about her research.
Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about my chapter in the volume. I can see that my camera is being a little wonky, so I apologize for that. I don't know what's going on with it. Hopefully it'll stay stable. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that we wanted to reflect upon was the ethical and emotional aspects of our work. We also discussed writing different genres and really thinking about graduate students as our audience, at least at one point in time. Some of the chapters ended up being fairly kind of standard academic style chapters, while others were a little more experimental. Particularly, I think Margot Temez's is in quite a different register. Hers is poetry and visual art. It's a really striking chapter. And in mine, I just used a slightly more conversational tone, and I really was thinking about graduate students as the audience. But I wanted to reflect on the emotional journey of my work with Indigenous women migrants incarcerated in immigration detention centers in Central Texas. So I have a recent book on the topic. So it's based on the women's oral histories and departs from them to analyze the settler capitalist state and the multiple ways Indigenous women are rendered vulnerable to racialized and gendered violence through its structures. So for a lot of reasons, this was a very difficult book to write. It emerged out of an activist engagement with the Hutto Visitation Program, through which volunteers accompany women detained in the infamous Teton Hutto immigration detention facility and monitor the human rights situation inside. That facility is a former medium security prison run by the private prison administrator, CCA, or it's now called Core Civic. And it had originally housed women and children, and was subject to a lawsuit by the Department of Homeland Security, which ended family detention there for a time. And then it was only housing women, but then the facility had been the subject of 2 federal investigations into sexual abuse against women and guard convicted on multiple counts of sexual assault. So it really needed monitoring. And my activist involvement morphed into a research project, over time. The stories of the women I visited really gave rise to it, as that, in this really sterile space of the visitation room inside the detention center, talking about their lives and how they had come to be caged in this place. And their stories were filled with violence, multiple forms, multiple kind of interconnected and interwoven violences. Often I was just astounded that they survived at all. And almost always their emotional trauma was quite palpable. Their stories spoke really directly and lucidly, I thought, to the structural violence of settler-occupied lands and kind of capitalist deprivations, and to the interlocking racial and gendered ideologies to which they were being multiply subject in that text. So the anthropologist in me felt compelled to write them down. And that was no small challenge, given that writing implements, really anything at all other than the clothes on your back, are prohibited inside the detention center. So I memorized what I could and, scribbled it down or typed it into my laptop in the parking lot, and later asking more questions to fill in the narrative on later visits. And, I would long deliberate on whether to tell those stories at all. And if I did tell them, how to do it without doing new violence to the women through my representations. So it was not a standard oral history project. I had a lot of mediation of the stories and how they would be told. So I grappled with that. And I also grappled with something else, which was trauma. So the Hutto facility is in Taylor, Texas, about an hour north of Austin, where I lived at the time. And I took that ride on country roads through farm fields with a familiar sense of unease, of anxiety, anger, pain, and sadness, kind of all mushed together in a physical reaction of kind of vague nausea and clenched muscles. And, that feeling was one I knew intimately, personally, as a survivor of sexual violence myself. It was a feeling I associated with trauma. So the thinking in this chapter, which I hope does not come across as a sort of poor me autoethnography type thing, which nobody wants, but rather, thinking analytically about our embodied experience of field research. And that thinking of mine was first emerged from the writing of a group of scholars I highly respect and recommend: Maya Berry, Claudia Chavez, Shania Cordis, Sarah Imood, and Eli Velasquez, who wrote a beautiful piece called Fugitive Anthropology. And I opened the chapter with a quote from one of their collective essays on fugitive anthropology. So I'll just read you that quote. They say, our written words betray our screams, which are neither audible nor appropriate in the academy, confronting violence not just as individual survivors, but as knowledge producers enhances our collective struggle. So they were writing about activist research and power relations and violence in the field. And while my focus was a bit different, it was on how we carry past violence or trauma with us into the field. I found their centering the body in the stakes of activist research as a path towards a project of decolonizing anthropology really rich. And they're advocating for a critical feminist activist anthropology that holds us politically accountable to our interlocutors, as well as to our own embodied reality, right, as part of the same liberatory struggle. So in the chapter, I offer a personal account of some aspects of field research, particularly, this feminist activist field research that are rarely discussed, right, we don't talk about, much less openly brought into our analysis, by which I mean the embodied experience of field research and its implications for the knowledge that we produce. So, departing from Berry et al., I revisit a long ago piece by Renato Rosaldo. I believe it's from 1984, early 80s, called "Grief and a Headhunter's Rage." Many of you may know it. And I should say that the title of my chapter is "Grief and an Indigenous Feminist's Rage." So in that piece, Rosaldo kind of shocked the anthropological world by writing about and theorizing from his personal grief and mourning at the loss of his wife, feminist anthropologist Michelle Rosaldo, who slipped and fell to her death in a tragic accident while she was conducting field research in the Philippines. And Rosaldo argued that until he had experienced intense personal grief and the rage born of it, he could not fully comprehend what his Ilongot headhunter collaborators told him about the relationship between headhunting, grief, and rage. That only through lived personal pain was he able to reach those insights that would allow him to comprehend the practices he was seeing and hearing in his field research. So what was so radical about Rosaldo's argument at the time was not so much his revelation of emotion in a field still dominated by the idea of positivism and positivist objectivity, but his argument that he had gained a level of intellectual depth and understanding of his fieldwork by drawing on the force of emotions he experienced as a result of his profound grief. So I kind of cite Ruth Behar, who wrote kind of poetically about that work and said that Renato gave us a new map, and this was a map about a different kind of academy, and where we didn't have to check our hearts at the gate. Then I go on to say, if he laid out that map, we didn't get a copy of it in graduate school, and I don't think most people are circulating it in anthropology today. We're not encouraged to pick it up and consult it as we move through the course of our academic careers, right? So in spite of several decades of anthropological reflexivity, and I would add some problematic forays into autographic folly, we still do not often raise our profound and difficult emotions and give consideration to how they shape our understandings of what we encounter in the field. So, I look at how it hasn't been taken, Rosalda's intervention really hasn't been taken up in the field, and then I try to apply it to my own experience. So I actually narrate my story of gender violence in exactly the same register that I use for the women's stories, which was a really interesting exercise, since I had to reflect on how I had reflected so much on how to write their story so that they would not kind of recolonize the women, and writing my own story in that register. I felt how it would feel to have your story, a personal story of violence, told in that way. So, I think what I really want to argue through applying it in my own case and looking at my own experience is that I believe I would have understood the women's experiences very differently had I not been a survivor of gender violence. So in past activist research work, I've made the case that engagement with our interlocutors, that in an activist engagement kind of overlaps in terms of our political goals, and gives us accountability to our researchers, and that lead us to keep our politics front and center throughout the research. And I've argued that it makes for better knowledge production, because we have to keep those politics front and center. So in this piece, I argue that we need to keep our emotional subjectivities that we bring to the field research site front and center as well, and in order to understand how they affect our knowledge production. So basically the argument is that acknowledging our embodied experience of field research, including the emotional and affective aspects of that embodiment, is crucial, not only to have a less partial view of power relations, but because, as Rosaldo asserted, it may make for more profound understandings of the lives and experiences of those we collaborate with in the field and write about in our work. And in the end, it seems like a very simple point, but that is the point. So I'll leave it there and turn it over to Lynn, who's going to tell us about her chapter.
Okay, hi. Are we ready to do the share screen? Can I get some technical help with my slides? Are you seeing me or seeing? Okay. I need to reshare. Okay. Okay. I hope this is clear. Otherwise, I think I'm gonna proceed. So I'm going to depart a little bit from talking about my chapter, which is called Confronting Embodied Structures of Violence, Gendered Embodied Structures of Violence, Mom Indigenous Women Seeking Justice in Guatemala and the US. I wanted to talk a little bit about the different contexts that I've worked in the same way that Shannon did, that I draw on in this chapter and in the work ahead and currently. In 2018 and 2019, I was living in San Diego, was on a sabbatical, and I volunteered in a shelter for mostly Central American families who were being released from detention. I did intake work, I called people's relatives, I arranged flights and buses and accompanied people for many hours in the airport or on buses, and spent a lot of time talking to a lot of women, children, and also fathers who were traveling with kids. I also have been working, doing ethnographic observation in immigration court. I also give testimony as an expert witness. I've been interviewing asylum seekers and also immigration lawyers. And I have also been working to support a number of NGOs and lawyers to interview people seeking asylum, mostly from Guatemala and Mexico, Indigenous, helping them prepare their declarations and working with their lawyers, writing expert reports. And I've been working with a colleague, Dr. Aaron Beck, here at the University of Oregon in the past 5 years in several places in Guatemala, in Xela, Huehuetenango, and Guatemala City, observing in gender violence courts, interviewing judges, lawyers, survivors, their families, and people associated with these courts. But apart from that, talking with women, men, and other officials about what are the impediments to justice. And these projects sort of link together because the people who we're talking to, the cases we're listening to in Guatemala, and the other folks that we're interacting with are very connected to the very same communities who arrive in the state where I live and seek asylum. So I've used ethnography and theory to sort of disrupt binaries between state and non-state actors, and also to suggest that we cannot parse public and private actors in violence. And I've worked to expand understandings of politics and political opinion in relation to women resisting violence and also immigrant rights activists who are undocumented. So what I want to talk a little bit about today, which is in the chapter, but also ongoing, is the way that the research that I do and this sort of embodied perspective has resulted in concepts that I try to mobilize in immigration courtrooms to help people win asylum. So it has a very sort of direct application. So the research and the work that I do with women who are seeking asylum, primarily Mom and other Indigenous women, suggests that they're survivors of multiple overlapping forms of gender violence that are not separable into that perpetrated by the state versus private actors. What is often termed private domestic violence cannot be parsed from other kinds of violence. The same people who are connected through kinship, marriage, and other forms of non-public relationships are also connected to networks of local authorities, police, military, paramilitary, and organized crime actors. These local actors, institutions, and networks are also articulated with the state and its institutions and connected to state violence that is contemporary and historical in nature. So I mentioned that one of the points that a number of us have written about is the relationship between territory and transborder violence and different kinds of violence. So my research and that of others has suggested that women and their bodies have been viewed as a part of territories and forms of authority and control, from the household to the municipality to the department or the state and beyond, by competing groups of men exercise multiple forms of masculinity. And these multiple forms of masculinity, of course, affect women's bodies. Women's and girls' responses and those of people who support them, that often includes other men, to masculine authority exercised through multiple violences is initially to attempt to persevere, after long accumulated episodes of violence, but eventually to flee or to leave. And many end up traversing Mexico. They may arrive in the US or on the US border to apply for asylum. At least they did until the summer of 2019, when they were stopped by a number of measures from the US. But the people are there and have been waiting there. And now we have lots of families, lots of minors, and also lots of men piled up on our southern border. Most of the cases I've worked on involve women who suffered from multiple forms of interlocking violence that includes domestic violence, militarization, paramilitarization, state security interventions, forced displacement, and gang activity. My work as an expert witness for Mom female refugees and my research in Guatemala has embedded me in ongoing emotional, intellectual, and strategic relationships with people and structures that stretch from Oregon to Mexico to Guatemala. The process of taking in the stories of Indigenous women asylum seekers and listening to the experiences of gendered violence as described by survivors and their family members in court and in interviews in Guatemala and the United States has deepened my own understanding of structural and embodied violences borne by Mom Indigenous refugees. And I didn't write about this, but I am also a survivor of sexual assault. I wrote in the book more about my sort of emotional response to listening to Trump on the radio and what was happening to the folks I was working hard with to try to get asylum for, and sort of unwinding in that sense. But I think maybe I have something else left to write. But what these connections have pushed me to do when we talk about accountability is to offer support and allyship. And primarily I'm doing that through my pro bono work on asylum cases as an expert witness, in helping people prepare declarations, and in other forms of support. I've been a pro bono witness in more than 100 asylum cases to date. I use the concept of gendered embodied structures of violence to bring together militarized, paramilitarized, kinship, and masculinized governance and justice in the bodies that these forces act on. By speaking of gendered embodied structures in court, in publications, or elsewhere, we can challenge the idea that gendered and other violences can be directly imputed to direct state or non-state actors. States implicitly or explicitly delegate their power to other actors, as seen through ongoing processes of settler colonialism and other forms of colonialism that continue to unfold in Guatemala through extraction, the ceding of indigenous territories to organized crime and affiliated groups, and the counter-reaction of citizen security groups that have the indirect or direct approval of many local and regional parts of the Guatemalan state apparatus. And there are similar dynamics in other Central American countries and in Mexico. Historically, the boundaries between state and non-state actors in the perpetration of violence have been blurred by the relations between, for example, Guatemala's army and its supervision of state-mandated patrullas de autodefensa civil, or civil defense patrols. The Mom women refugees and their families I've served as an expert for have carried gendered embodied structures of violence with them, tied to these structures through multiple generations that still affects their lives today. Since 2018 in the US, the Jeff Sessions ruling that essentially eliminated domestic violence and gang violence as a basis for receiving asylum means that I have been asked, often by immigration lawyers, to provide expert testimony that centers on women's rights as a form of political opinion. This is a strategy to get around the fact that right now the US in the past 2 years has not considered domestic violence to be grounds for asylum. There were decades of work in this area that finally got some traction let's say between 2010 and 2016, but it lost all momentum in 2018. In recent reports and testimony, I've worked to establish that women who resist violence, complain to relatives, attempt to file a complaint, or go to the police following incidents of violence, or even don't go to the police, are demonstrating an opinion. Defying male relatives and authorities, or simply speaking in public, can be interpreted as a public opinion when women have learned to be silenced. This nuanced argument requires a reframing of where and how political opinion is demonstrated and understood. And this is where my work as an ethnographer comes in talking about how in rural communities in Western Guatemala, for example, if a woman complains to several relatives about being a survivor of violence and her belief that this is wrong, this should be construed as a political opinion, particularly if within her extended family, the norm is for women not to speak up. This is even more clearly the case when community authorities who ignore women's attempts to report violence, as has also been the case in a number of many cases I've worked on, are linked by kinship to most of the community. So politics is not separable into public and private realms. That's an old lesson, but we can redeploy it. The Biden administration says they will conduct a comprehensive examination in 180 days to determine whether the U.S. provides protection for those fleeing domestic and gang violence in a manner consistent with international standards. I would say the U.S. does not, and we don't need to wait. We should start to provide this protection immediately. I also have a lot of ideas about how we really need to reframe our asylum system. It's horribly outdated and does not deal with the circumstances and the groups of people who flee together. Finally, I just want to make a comment about the importance of healing that I've been a part of, but which is very important to emphasize in terms of the women whose asylum cases I've worked on and people associated with them. And that is the process of sort of reconstituting the social body elsewhere. Could be in many spots in Oregon that I interact with. And that could be through dancing, it could be through music, it could be through soccer, it could be through childcare, it could be through meals, through cooking. Collectively, of course, COVID has made this much more difficult, but it's still happening. So I want to just end with that and put up a slide with a few thank yous. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for this eye-opening account of your engaged scholarship and activism on behalf of Indigenous peoples, in particular Indigenous women who are survivors of violence and seeking justice. Clearly, this is emotionally embodied scholarship, as your bravery in being witnesses in all the ways you have described. We thank you for sharing your stories with us and also for your bravery. And I think that if there are questions from the audience, and here's a question for both of you. What methodology did the group develop during the Radcliffe Gathering to address how to share the Indigenous women's stories in ways that centered their agency in the process?
I can start an answer to that. So, I mean, I think that our conversation was really around the question of the ways that when we talk about violence against women, women become victims, and what does it mean to, in particular, my work was analyzing their vulnerability to violence. And so, we were kind of understanding the the complicated nature of terms like vulnerability, right, which could be understood as like an inherent quality of the women themselves, that it's somehow their fault for being vulnerable, when in fact, of course, we know that those vulnerabilities come from, structures of power that they're enmeshed in. And so, I think we just kind of talked through the problematics of those terms and how to be certain that we were addressing them in ways in each of our chapters that highlighted women's agency, which for us was all important and very, very apparent in all of the work that we did.
Yeah, I think I would just add, first, we did talk about structures, but there are a number of chapters in the book that really emphasize, for example, Indigenous women's organizing in prison, Indigenous women who have challenged Indigenous structures of policing and justice. There's one chapter in the book by Maria Teresa Sierra that describes women organizing within an Indigenous justice system and policing system to try to get the kinds of issues that women were bringing to the table there. So there are different ways that people bring agency forward, but I definitely think there was a real consciousness of not sort of doing victim porn and trying to center ideas and ways of conceptualizing that come from the work, as well as also centering women as agents, and emphasizing that perspective of collective agency versus individual agency and the importance of that.
Thank you. Thank you. Do we have any other questions?
Hi, my name is Jenna, and I am a junior studying gender and women's studies here at the University of Rhode Island. Thank you both so much for coming to talk tonight. I do have a question for Dr. Speed. I was wondering, as an Indigenous woman, how do you maintain your Chickasaw identity despite physical and emotional harm done to Native communities?
Thanks, Jenna. It's nice to meet you, and that's an interesting question. I feel like the physical and emotional harm done to Indigenous communities enlivens my sense of being an Indigenous woman, being part of an Indigenous community, and being part of a larger collective of Indigenous peoples, right? And one of the things I talk about in this chapter is kind of the ways that, it enrages me, the violence done, the damage done, and the ways that rage as an emotion motivate me in the work that I do and the things that I care about. So kind of rage as a productive force for good. So yeah, thank you for the question.
Do we have another question from the audience? Oh, Katie McIntyre, my colleague. Also, someone who does research in Oaxaca. Maybe Lynn, Professor Katie McIntyre, I'm not sure.
Hi, Katie.
Actually. How can we encourage more scholars to use their scholarship to help Native women? Mom, for example, asylum seekers.
Well, I think there are many academics who become expert witnesses. The American Anthropological Association often has forums. The Latin American Studies Association now has a whole new section on expert witnessing, not just doing it, but also sharing strategies, looking at resources and ways to build arguments. I think, and there are different forms of expert witnessing. A number of people in the book, Irma Alicia Velázquez Nimatu, who is a Quiché anthropologist, has served as an expert witness in very high-profile trials, including Sepiazarco, which was a trial against several military officers accused of sort of not only sexual violence, but enslaving women. Others in the book have worked in international courts as expert witnesses, and then other people have engaged in what we describe in the book as sort of activist or collaborative research, where the agenda from the research that you deploy yourself to work in comes from an Indigenous organization or community. Shannon, I'm sure you have something to add.
No, that answer.
Is there one more question? Here's one. What would you say to other scholars who might say that they can't do embodied research such as this, or address topics like gender and race-based violence because they have not themselves experienced it?
So I would say that embodied research isn't about trauma. I mean, I focus on trauma in my chapter because that's part of my experience, and it was something I shared with the women I was researching. But what I would say is that we're all doing embodied research all the time. All research is embodied. You don't get out of your body to go, or out of your memories or your subjectivity to go do field research. So in the long discussion about positivist kind of neutrality and objectivity, we've come to reflexively kind of think about our positionality, what the positionality that we bring to our knowledge production. But so we talk about, our gender, our class, things like that, and and we do that ostensibly to think about how it affects our knowledge production. But we all have an embodied emotional experience as well that we tend not to acknowledge. And so really the argument of the chapter, the plea, is for us to also take into account in that positioning of ourselves and our knowledge production, what experiences we do bring with us to the field, because we're all bringing, all of the experiences we've ever had with us to the field, right? So that's all it is. Everyone has experiences that will shape how they produce knowledge.
Yeah, I think just to add, we've all been taught to acknowledge our positionality, maybe acknowledge our politics, because that makes it transparent, it makes it clear. But I think we all, in the Western Academy, we inherit like a divide between our hearts, our minds, and our bodies. And, we're supposed to separate our emotions. So somehow that's been the last sort of piece of subjectivity that often gets left out. So just, we're victims of, not victims, but we're operating, if you ask that question, under a particular way of thinking about humanness and subjectivity. So we can all rethink that in the way that Shannon suggested.
Yes, and I would thank you. And I would like to also add an additional question, hopefully to end on a somewhat positive note. Of the women that you have engaged with, the women that you have counseled, that you have been an expert witness to or for, how many of those, or what percentage, were able to secure asylum, those who were requesting asylum?
Is that a question for both of us?
Or for you, Lynn, first?
Okay, well, we've both done this work. It's the simple thing about asylum is that it depends on the judge. It's a crazy system. So you could make the same argument with the same case, with the same information in a judge who has an asylum granting rate of 3%. And you could take that case with the same person, the same expert, in front of a different judge who has a 80% or 60%, sort of granting rates. So that's more what it's about. Most people who seek asylum don't have lawyers even necessarily, and they don't have experts. So it's a fairly narrow group of people. So, I've been fortunate. A lot of the people I've worked with have had good lawyers. They've had me and decent judges. So often you don't always get asylum. There are other kinds of protections that people seek, but it has gotten progressively harder as the Trump administration put in immigration judges that were formerly government lawyers. So there's been a lot of turnover, and I think that success is, I think it's hard to think about it just in that sense. Accompanying people, working with them, supporting them, I think is also very important.
I would just add to that. I agree with everything Lynn said, but it's not just individuals, but it depends on what circuit, what court circuit. And most of the asylum cases that I worked on, I did when I lived in Texas, which is a court circuit that has a very, 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 very low asylum rate. So most of the cases that I worked on did not gain asylum in the first round. So what you're doing is basically building a case for appeal.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, on behalf of the Department of Gender and Women's Studies of the University of Rhode Island, we wish to thank you for sharing your work with us and your activism. And I wish everyone a good night. Thank you.